In this lecture, we are going to discuss tissues as part of a two-part lecture on tissues and homeostasis. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to define epithelial, muscle, nervous, and connective tissues, the endocrine and exocrine glands, and what a fibroblast is. Be able to differentiate between different types of epithelial tissues, meaning that you will need to define each type of epithelial tissue and compare them. Differentiate between types of connective tissues, meaning defining each type and comparing them. Differentiate between muscle tissues, meaning, you guessed it, defining and comparing. And list functions for each different type of tissue. So this is an issue about multicellularity. The advantages of multicellularity are that different cells can be very specialized, allowing certain subjobs to be done by some cells. Not every cell is a neuron. Not every cell is a muscle. Another advantage is that there is an increased surface area to volume ratio, as each individual cell is able to have a larger surface area in the medium. This also means that there is an increased mobility on a larger scale. If you are in a race between yourself and an amoeba, you'll win because you're multicellular and you're much larger. There are obstacles to multicellularity, though. Each individual cell, being able to do only a few jobs, cannot survive on its own because it cannot do all the jobs necessary for survival. You also have to keep the cells connected, or you aren't really a multicellular organism so much as a quickly dissolving bundle of cells. Each cell needs to get nutrients, and coordination is needed between cells to achieve their ends. Now, cells are going to connect to each other by different proteins. And this is going to mean that they're anchored to one another or that they exist in a medium in which there are proteins. Cells can also be attached to what we will call basement membranes, and we're going to see those in our connective tissues. Connective tissues serve other tissues, and they are highly specialized. Muscle cells contract, nerve cells transmit impulses, and epithelial cells are on the surface of things. These different types of cells are what we will cover today, knowing that no single cell can survive on its own, but they each have powers that let them form tissues. A tissue is a group of specialized cells similar in structure that perform a common function. For example, in the kidney, you have these urinary tubules which are lined by simple cuboidal epithelium. This simple cuboidal epithelium acts to move ions out of filtrate, turning the filtrate into urine by concentrating it. And these cells have to be connected or they will not be able to function in moving ions between blood vessels and the filtrate. So you can see these simple cuboidal tissues are attached to a basement membrane. So these are an interaction between epithelial tissues and connective tissues. So let's look at the different types of tissues. First off, epithelial tissues. These are the cells that cover body surfaces and body cavities. Anything interacting with the outside is going to be covered in epithelial tissues. These are constantly dividing, and through abrasion, these are constantly falling off. Take, for example, your skin cells. Your skin cells are constantly falling off. Just rub your arm and see some keratinocytes go flying off into the medium. Those around you who might be breathing, congrats, you just breathed in some skin cells. Ew. Some of these epithelial cells are very highly specialized for absorption or secretion, and the thickness of the epithelium affects the rate of diffusion through the epithelium. For example, your skin is thick, and your thick skin cannot absorb oxygen, but your lung epithelial tissues are thin, and these can absorb oxygen. This is why we breathe through our lungs and not our skin. Frogs, on the other hand, have a thinner skin because they do breathe through their skin. So the thickness of the epithelium affects how quickly things diffuse through it. So there are different types of epithelium, and we're going to divide them into 6 different types in a simple 3x2 pattern. So be able to define these different types. First off is squamous, or squamous, and these are things that are in kind of rough, weird shapes like the scales of a lizard. Then there is cuboidal, which, as the name suggests, are cubes. Then there is columnar, which, as the name suggests, are long and thin and columns. These are the 3 types of cells. Now, these can be stratified or they can be simple. So simple squamous are those lizard-shaped cells that are going to be in a simple layer, single layer. Simple cuboidal, cubes in a single layer. Simple columnar, columns in a single layer. Stratified squamous is going to be stratified multiple different layers of these lizard scale shaped cells. Stratified cuboidal is basically a stack of bricks. And your stratified columnar, this is going to be these stratified, these stacked columns. And sometimes the stacked columns are more columns of different sizes that may be on the top or the bottom. We can also see that some of these epithelial tissues are specialized for secretion, and these would be your endocrine and exocrine glands. These form from the epithelium. An exocrine gland is going to remain open to the outside. An endocrine gland is going to only be open to the inside. So endocrine glands are going to secrete things to the inside. Think hormones. The endocrine system is a system of different epithelial tissues that secrete hormones to the body. These use the bloodstream to transmit hormones. Remember endocrine signaling from earlier. These are to affect other organs that are distant from the endocrine glands. These are not paracrine signaling. These are endocrine signaling. Exocrine glands secrete things to the outside, such as sweat. Those are exocrine glands. Digestive fluids are also secreted by exocrine glands because technically what is inside your intestine is outside of your body. So the lumen of the intestine is outside of your body, so digestive fluids are secreted by exocrine glands. And these glands are types of epithelial tissue specialized for secretion. Connective tissues come in many different forms. And we are not going to memorize every single one of these forms, but you should be very familiar with most of these. So we have the different types of connective tissue proper as your book will define it. Then we have adipose tissue and specialized tissue. So these special connective tissues, as your book defines it, are very similar to this special connective tissues in this diagram. So let's look at the connective components of these tissues. So how do we define connective tissue broadly? Well, it would be cells that are floating in a matrix of fibers. So these fibers can be collagen, elastin, or reticular fibers. And think of this as like different little chunks of meat floating in a casserole. If your noodles of the casserole would be your different types of fibers, and that kind of soupy mix of your casserole would be the intercellular fluid, then your little chunks of meat would be your cells. And some of these cells will be fibroblasts. And those are the cells that are secreting the fibers. There are also macrophages found in connective tissue. These are parts of your immune system that go around and eat any bacteria that they find in your connective tissue to keep things from, well, invading your body. And this can lead, of course, to inflammation if you do have a bacterial infection. So as your book defines, connective tissue proper. There is dense connective tissue and loose connective tissue. Dense connective tissue is mostly fibers. It's dense. The cells are interspersed between these fibers. Think of ligaments and tendons as dense connective tissue. And ligaments and tendons will connect muscular tissue to bone tissue. And there is loose connective tissue, which are cells in a looser network of fibers. This can be the basement membrane for the epithelia of intestines and trachea. So you may have seen the basement membrane on those slides about epithelial tissue. This is what the basement membrane is made of, loose connective tissue. There is also adipose tissue, the fat cells. So these are a very few connective tissue fibers and a lot of adipocytes, or fat cells. Now there are three different types, and two of which we're actually going to look at. There is white fat, which has a single large droplet of fat in each cell. It has mitochondria, but not very many. Beige fat, we're not really covering it in the book, but it's somewhere between white and brown. Brown fat has many different droplets and many mitochondria. Brown fat, with these mitochondria, generates heat. White fat stores energy. Brown fat generates heat primarily in babies because these babies have not the best thermal regulation. They're very small, so they need to actually generate a little more heat. Brown fat is also present in adults, but not in a large amount. Most of the fat in adults is going to be white fat for the storage of energy in that single large droplet of fat. There are specialized connective tissues as well, and these are going to come up several more times, especially in the lecture on bones. There is, of course, cartilage, which is collagen fibers, proteins, and polysaccharides. In cartilage, there are chondrocytes, which will secrete these collagen fibers, proteins, and polysaccharides. Cartilage has poor blood circulation and thus takes a long time to heal. The three types of cartilage that you do not have to memorize for this lecture, but might want to be familiar with. There's hyaline cartilage, which reduces friction in joints, elastic cartilage, which is flexible, found in your ears and nose, and fibrocartilage, which can undergo tension and pressure, found in the discs of your spinal column. This is found between those bones of your spinal column. You find the fibrocartilage, which can withstand tension and pressure. Another type of specialized connective tissue is bone, which is calcium phosphate and proteins, making a hard and inflexible structure. Another type of specialized connective tissue is actually blood, which are cells suspended in a liquid medium. Remember, the definition of connective tissue is cells suspended in an intercellular medium. Technically, blood is cells, your red blood cells and white blood cells, suspended in your liquid medium, your plasma. These are the different types of specialized connective tissue. Muscle tissue is a different beast altogether. This is not a connective tissue, this is muscle tissue. And there are three types of muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle has what are called striations, which means there are these parts of the cytoskeleton lined up in such a way that you can actually see stripes. These cells also have many different nuclei and many different mitochondria. These are longer cells, and we're going to see the skeletal muscle in the voluntary muscular system. Cardiac muscle is found exclusively in the heart and has gap junctions, which mean these different cells can share the same ions and can share the same electrical charge, allowing the whole heart to contract as a unit. Smooth muscle cells are tapered. They can contract around a tube. Smooth muscle cells will be found in blood vessels. They will also be found in the intestines, where they can squeeze around a tube and squeeze the stuff within. Nervous tissue will be the subject of our lecture on nerves. We're going to get more complex a little later on, but for now I want you to know the terms neurons and glial cells. Neurons are specialized to transmit electrical impulses, and these are what we're going to look at with action potentials and the movement of electricity and the movement of signals between synapses. That's going to be neurons. There are also glial cells in nervous tissue, which act to support neurons and help the neurons to function. So these are the different types of tissue. Remember, epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous, and look within each one to see the different types within.